Hi, and welcome back. This is our last class lecture. So I want to talk a little bit about how you can get involved in archaeology. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get this started. Okay, I can't see it yet. There we go. Now I can see it. So I want to talk a little bit about archaeological ethics, how we do archaeology, and the opportunities that are available to you. So much of the archaeology that is done in the United States is done for compliance with federal law. And there are two main laws: the National Historic Preservation Act, that was passed in 1966, and the National Environmental Policy Act, that was passed in 1970. However, these laws don't apply to all archaeological sites all over the country. The laws really apply in situations where the federal government has some sort of handle, some sort of connection to a property or an activity on that property. And the reason I have this picture in there, if you're building a swimming pool in the back of your house on private land that requires no government money or funding or permits and is not on government land, these laws don't apply. Instead, they apply in situations where there's a property that's government land, or the buying and selling of government land, or a project that is using government money, or something that requires federal permits. And the archaeology that's then required under these laws in these situations is done under the auspices of an industry that we call cultural resource management. So, cultural resource management is the archaeology, architectural history, historic preservation, and sometimes even cultural anthropology that is done for compliance with laws like the National Historic Preservation Act and National Environmental Policy Act in situations where there's government land, government money, or government permits. So, what is a cultural resource? Well, the laws don't actually define it very well. They define it as any resource of a cultural character. But it can also be described as a historic property, which can include archaeological properties as defined by the National Historic Preservation Act. So this is kind of circular, but cultural resources are archaeological sites, they're historic properties, they can be cultural landscapes, something called traditional cultural properties. They can be a community group, for example, or a traditional cultural practice. A cultural resource could include something like, today in this area we have the Gullah Geechee National Historic or National Heritage Corridor. Um, this is basically a region of where there are traditional practices, where there are communities that retain a tie to their Gullah ancestors, and continue some of those practices. This is, it's not defined as particularly a land, but it's a community, it's a culture, right? These are all cultural resources, but archaeological sites are a big part of this category. Now, there's another law that is very important for archaeologists and for museums, and this is called NAGPRA. This is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1989. Now, this law requires that human remains and associated objects that are housed in museums that receive some federal funding or that are found on federal land must be part of consultation with descendant communities, the descendants of those whose ancestors lived there, and potentially repatriated back to those communities. The goal is repatriation, but some communities aren't necessarily ready or able to receive those things and may say to the museums, we want you to hold them while we build a cultural center, and then we will take these human remains or these associated objects back. Ultimately, this law has led to a big shift of power from archaeologists and museums to Native American people, and has given Native American people the ability and the right to have more control in what happens to the remains of their ancestors and their ancestors' belongings. But NAGPRA only applies to federally funded museums on federal land and to federally recognized tribes. So, for example, we talked last class about the Waccamaw Indian people. The Waccamaw are not federally recognized. They are state recognized tribe. And the state of South Carolina does not have a parallel law like NAGPRA that applies to state tribes. Interestingly, there is one state that does. California has something that they call CalNAGPRA that applies to state recognized tribes on state land. But South Carolina doesn't have that. So the Waccamaw Indian people of Horry County are unfortunately kind of cut out from NAGPRA consultation and do not have the ability to request the repatriation of their ancestors' remains. Now, under NAGPRA, there are very specific things that are included for repatriation and consultation. And those include human remains, those include associated funerary objects. So those are things like that are placed in a grave with a person who was buried. There are unassociated funerary objects, and what those are things that are usually placed in a grave, but for some reason, often because a museum didn't have very good record keeping, those objects have been somehow separated from the person they were buried with. But we know they're usually placed in burials, so those are called unassociated funerary objects. And then sacred objects, and then a category called objects of cultural patrimony. And what those are things that belong to the entire community and could never have been individually sold. So for the US, that might be something like the Liberty Bell, right? It belongs to all of us as Americans, but I couldn't sell it, for example. So objects of cultural patrimony are things that are held by the community in common. And if they were sold to a museum, no one actually had the right to do that. So archaeologists must follow ethical practice. And that means that we must follow these federal laws, state laws and local laws when they apply. Archaeologists must obtain proper permission to conduct archaeological excavations. We must work with descendant communities, either because it is required under NAGPRA or because it is considered ethical practice. And archaeologists must be qualified. So SOI qualified archaeologists, that means Secretary of the Interior qualified archaeologists, are archaeologists who have had a specific level of training, generally to include a graduate degree and field training, in order to lead archaeological projects. So I am an SOI qualified archaeologist, and have led projects all over the country. Now, many archaeologists are also RPA certified. This stands for Register of Professional Archaeologists. And I'm an RPA certified archaeologist as well. And what this means is that, first of all, it means I'm SOI qualified, but it also means that I have pledged to adhere to specific ethical standards that includes reporting. So if I find out that someone is engaging in unethical practice by signing on as RPA certified, I agree to report those situations. And the RPA has a disciplinary board that will conduct a hearing and potentially remove our RPA certification or censor archaeologists who are not following ethical practice. Now, there are often times when the community finds an archaeological site. For example, if you are a farmer and you happen to find an archaeological site on your property, there are also opportunities for the public to report those archaeological sites so that they can receive a level of protection. So the South Carolina Institute for Archaeology and Anthropology, we call the SCIA, has a reporting form for the public where the public can engage with the state to report archaeological finds and make sure that they are well documented. This also is considered ethical practice. So how do you get experience in archaeology? Well, the main way is to attend an archaeological field school. So Coastal has 3 different archaeological field schools. Anthropology 396. This is the historical archaeology field school. It is typically taught in Maymester. It's often taught every other Maymester and is taught by Dr. David Palmer, usually. We also have a prehistoric archaeology field school that I have taught pretty regularly. I haven't taught it in a couple of semesters, but if you're interested in prehistoric archaeology, keep an eye out for that. And then we have a class called Anthropology 398, Archaeological Field Research, that we are working to turn into a Maymester field school. Or I'm sorry, not Maymester, a spring break. I misspoke. A spring break field school where students would do some online learning leading up to spring break and then spend the entire spring break week in the field. And then after spring break, would spend time in the lab processing and analyzing the artifacts we collect. So I'm hoping to be teaching that very soon, so keep an eye out for that. There are also field schools outside of Coastal, and many of them, if they're affiliated with a university and accredited by a university, you can get transfer credits that will come back here to Coastal and count towards your degree. You also can, of course, volunteer, but in order to get a job in archaeology, particularly as an entry-level field technician in cultural resource management, you would be expected to have completed an archaeological field school. But there are a lot of jobs available in cultural resource management where you can work as a field technician, working on excavations, or work in the lab. And yes, these are all paid jobs. When I first graduated from college, I worked full-time as a field technician in cultural resource management. There are also jobs in museums for archaeologists. I also worked in museums. I worked at the University of Pennsylvania Museum for 4 years. I worked at the Hearst Museum at Berkeley for 3 years. And most archaeologists who work in museums are working in collections management or collections research. But there are also other kinds of jobs. Some archaeological sites are part of state parks or federal, National Park Service kinds of places. And there are jobs as interpreters or tour guides. There are jobs as educators. There are museums that have an education department, or there are sometimes state agencies that will have educators with a background in archaeology who are teaching people about prehistory and history through an archaeological lens. And then finally, there are nonprofits that you can work for that will hire archaeologists either to do archaeological research or to work on grant-funded projects, for example. So there are definitely jobs in the field. And if you're interested in any of these, come talk to me. We can talk more about them. And that's all I have for you for today. Thanks for a great semester.